History remembers him by a name that sounds like a curse: Charles the Bad, a villain so treacherous, so slippery, and so consumed by ambition that chroniclers of his time claimed he had poison running through his veins instead of blood. They painted him as a master of intrigue, a man who would smile as he signed your death warrant, a prince who played England against France like a game of chess while the world around him burned. But behind the moniker of the villain, behind the legends of dark sorcery and political betrayal, lay a man who was, above all, human, fragile, bitter, and ultimately mortal. And his end was not on a battlefield, sword in hand, gloriously defending his stolen birthright. It was not by the executioner's axe, despite the many times he flirted with treason. No. The death of Charles II of Navarre is perhaps the most horrifying, grotesque, and ironic finale in the history of royalty. It is a story so shocking that for centuries people believed it was a myth, a dark fable invented to scare children. But the records are there, whispered in the dusty archives of Pamplona. Imagine, if you can, a king in his own bedchamber. It is the dead of winter, January the 1st, 1387. The air is cold, but the room is stiflingly hot, heavy with the smell of sickness and strong spirits. The king is old before his time, his body ravaged by a mysterious illness that has turned his skin grey and his limbs useless. He cannot move. He is at the mercy of his doctors, and in their desperate arrogance, they prescribe a cure that sounds like madness to modern ears. They order him to be sewn, literally stitched tight, into linen sheets soaked in high-proof brandy, aqua vitae, the water of life. They believed the alcohol would burn out the sickness, that the vapors would revitalize the king's failing heart. Instead, they created a human candle. All it took was a single thread, a careless servant, and a flickering flame. What happened next was not a medical procedure, but an agonizing conflagration. The king, unable to move, unable to escape, watched as the blue flame danced up the sheets, enveloping him in a heat so intense it fused the fabric to his flesh. His screams echoed through the stone corridors of the palace, a sound so primal that those who heard it crossed themselves, believing the devil himself had finally come to collect his debt. But to understand why this horror happened, and why so many in Europe whispered that it was the judgment of God, we have to go back. We have to strip away the charred remains and the smell of burnt flesh to find the boy who existed before the monster. Because Charles was not born the bad. He was made that way. He was forged in the fires of resentment, sculpted by a theft so grand it stole the destiny of an entire bloodline. This is not just the story of a gruesome death. It is the story of a lifetime of anger that burned long before the fire ever touched his skin. This is the tragedy of the King of Navarre. And I ask you to stay until the very end, because the details of that final night, the specific, excruciating minutes of his passing, reveal a truth about power and fragility that will change the way you look at history forever. To understand the fire that consumed him, we must understand the coldness that welcomed him into the world. Charles was born in October 1332 in the shadow of a crown he would never wear. From his very first breath, he was a walking political problem. His mother was Joan II of Navarre, the only surviving child of King Louis VI of France. In a just world, or at least a consistent one, Joan should have been Queen of France, and Charles, her son, should have been the heir to the greatest throne in Christendom. He should have been King Charles of France, but the 14th century was not a time of justice. It was a time of lawyers and swords. When Louis VI died, the French nobility, terrified of being ruled by a woman and suspicious of Joan's legitimacy due to an old scandal involving her mother, invented a rule. They dug up an ancient law of the Salic Franks, a dusty text from the Dark Ages, which stated that a woman could not inherit the throne. They used this legal trickery to strip Joan of her birthright and hand the crown to her uncles and eventually to the House of Valois. Charles grew up knowing this. It was the lullaby sung to him in the nursery. He was the grandson of a king, yet he was pushed aside. He was a Capetian, a direct descendant of the Holy Line, yet he watched as his cousins, the Valois, who he considered usurpers, mere counts and dukes playing at royalty, sat on the throne that belonged to him. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Imagine growing up in the French court, walking through the halls of the Louvre and the Palace of the Cité, looking at the tapestries, the jewels, the bowing courtiers, and thinking, "This is mine. All of this is mine." And yet, you have to bow. You have to smile. You have to pledge allegiance to the very men who stole your future. As a child, Charles was small, wiry, and fiercely intelligent. While other boys practiced with heavy broadswords, learning the blunt trauma of warfare, Charles learned the sharper, deadlier art of words. He learned that a whispered rumor could do more damage than a cavalry charge. He learned that a contract was only binding until you found a way to break it. He possessed a natural charisma, a way of speaking that could charm a snake, but behind his bright, alert eyes, there was a cold, calculating void. He spent his youth in France, effectively a hostage of the king, though they called him a guest. The king, John II, known as John the Good, a title that must have made Charles vomit with laughter, tried to keep him close. They gave him land, they gave him a title, they even gave him the king's daughter, Joan of France, in marriage. But these were not gifts. They were bribes. They were golden chains meant to keep the dangerous little Prince of Navarre quiet. But Charles would not be quiet. He saw the incompetence of the Valois kings. He saw France suffering under the early plagues, the famines, and the crushing defeats by the English in the 100 Years' War. He saw a kingdom being mismanaged by men he considered inferiors, and in his mind, his ambition wasn't treachery, it was correction. He wasn't trying to steal the throne, he was trying to reclaim it. The court of France in the mid-1300s was a dangerous place, a viper's nest of factions. On one side, the loyalists to King John. On the other, a growing group of dissatisfied nobles who looked at the chaos of the war and wondered if they had backed the wrong horse. Charles, even as a young man, became the magnet for this discontent. He was the alternative, the what-if. He had a magnetic pull. He was eloquent, quick-witted, and undoubtedly brave in his own way. But there was something missing in him. A moral compass, perhaps, or the ability to feel loyalty. He viewed people as pieces on a board, and why shouldn't he? He had been treated as a pawn since birth. His mother had been a pawn. His marriage was a pawn's move. He decided very early on that if the world was going to treat him like a piece in a game, he would become the player. The resentment festered. It grew like a cancer in his soul. Every slight, every overlooked honor, every moment he had to kneel before King John fed the fire. He began to surround himself with dangerous men, mercenaries, cutthroats, and disenchanted knights. He began to whisper in the ears of the English, the mortal enemies of France. And here is where the tragedy truly begins. Not with the fire in 1387, but with the spark of hatred in the 1350s. Charles didn't just want power, he wanted revenge. He wanted to tear down the House of Valois brick by brick. He wanted to see them humiliate, just as his mother had been humiliated. This need for vengeance would drive him to commit acts of such shocking betrayal that he would earn his dark nickname. But before the bad king fully emerged, there was a moment, a brief window, where he could have been the savior of France. He was popular in Paris. The merchants loved him. The students of the university cheered when he rode by. He had the common touch that the stiff, chivalric King John lacked. The people looked at Charles of Navarre and saw a glimmer of hope, a prince who spoke their language, who understood their suffering. He could have used that love to unite the kingdom. He could have been the great advisor, the power behind the throne, the man who saved the dynasty. But the wound of his disinheritance was too deep. The ghost of the crown he never wore haunted him. He couldn't serve the usurpers. He had to destroy them. And so, the stage was set. The sensitive, brilliant, entitled boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had decided that if he couldn't rule France, he would make sure no one else could rule it in peace. He was about to unleash a storm of intrigue that would bring the kingdom to its knees. But little did he know, as he plotted in the shadows of the Louvre, that the path of fire he was walking would eventually lead him back to his own bedchamber, to a lonely room in Pamplona, and to a candle flame that was waiting patiently to consume him whole. This was the origin of the monster, but the rise of the monster and the crimes that would blacken his soul were only just beginning. The 1350s were a time when the apocalypse felt near. The Black Death had just swept through Europe, leaving silence and graveyards in its wake. France was bleeding, locked in an endless war with England. And in this chaos, Charles of Navarre saw his ladder to the stars. His rise was not marked by grand battles won on open fields, but by whispers in dark corridors and daggers in the night. Charles understood something that the chivalrous, honor-obsessed King John II did not. Chaos is a ladder. While the king was busy playing the noble knight, Charles was busy rewriting the rules of the game. He began to cultivate a dangerous double life. To the court in Paris, he was the king's son-in-law, a high-ranking prince of the blood, a man of refined taste and eloquent speech. But in secret, he was negotiating with the enemy. He opened channels with Edward III of England, promising support, promising access to his lands in Normandy, lands that were strategically vital for an English invasion. He was selling the keys to France's back door. But his most shocking act, the one that signaled to the world that Charles was no ordinary schemer, happened in 1354. It involved the king's favorite, a man named Charles de Lacerda. Lacerda was everything Charles of Navarre despised. He was a favorite of King John, showered with titles and lands that Charles felt belonged to him. Lacerda had been given the county of Angoulême, a territory Charles believed was his birthright. The insult was too much. The simmering resentment boiled over. Charles didn't challenge Lacerda to a duel. That was for fools. Instead, he organized a hit squad. In January 1354, at an inn in L'Aigle, Charles's men cornered the royal favorite. They dragged him out of his bed, ironically a foreshadowing of Charles's own helpless end in a bed decades later, and butchered him. It was a cold-blooded assassination of a high-ranking noble, a close friend of the king. In any other time, Charles would have been executed for treason. But this was Charles of Navarre. He didn't hide. He didn't flee. He proudly admitted to the murder, claiming it was justice. And because he was so powerful, because he had the English king on speed dial, King John was forced to pardon him. Imagine the scene, the King of France grinding his teeth, forced to publicly forgive the man who murdered his best friend, simply because Charles was too dangerous to touch. It was a humiliation for the crown, and a massive victory for Charles. He had proven he was untouchable. This was his golden age. He was the most feared man in France. He walked the streets of Paris like a dark messiah. When King John was captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, a disaster Charles likely smiled at, France fell into anarchy. The Dauphin, the future Charles III, was young and inexperienced. Charles of Navarre saw his chance. He entered Paris not as a conqueror, but as a demagogue. He stood on platforms and preached to the angry mobs. He told them the Valois were corrupt, that they had lost the war, that they were taxing the poor to pay for their own failures. He whipped the people into a frenzy. For a brief moment it seemed possible that the mob might overthrow the Dauphin and crown Charles of Navarre. He was the king of the people, the charismatic leader who promised a new dawn. But this was the forbidden element of his life. His addiction wasn't just power, it was chaos. He couldn't stop. He played the Parisians against the Dauphin against the English, and the English against the French. He was juggling daggers, and he was addicted to the adrenaline of the cut. There was a specific quality to his ambition that was almost pathological. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to destroy the board. He allied with the Jacquerie, the violent peasant rebellion, and then betrayed them when it suited him. He promised the English he would help them take Paris, then switched sides when the Dauphin offered him land. He was a weather vane, spinning in a hurricane of his own making. The forbidden aspect of his life was his complete rejection of the feudal code. In a world held together by oaths of loyalty, Charles treated an oath as a lie you hadn't been caught in yet. This made him incredibly successful in the short term, but it rotted the foundations of his power. He was building a castle on quicksand. His charisma was his weapon, but it was also his poison. He could convince anyone of anything. There are stories of him being imprisoned in the Louvre later in his life, and he would talk to his jailers with such sweetness, such reason, that they would end up weeping for him, convinced he was a saintly victim of a cruel king. He was a master manipulator, a sociopath in royal velvet. But the darkness of the world around him was catching up. France was a ruin. The countryside was ravaged by free companies, bands of mercenaries who burned and looted at will. Many of these companies were secretly on Charles's payroll. He was burning his own potential kingdom to the ground just to be the king of the ashes. The contrast was stark. In his court in Navarre, in the Pyrenees, he was a cultured patron of the arts, a lover of fine things. But in France, he was the architect of misery. He was the man who let the wolves in. And as he reached the height of his power, around the late 1350s, a subtle shift began. The young Dauphin, Charles V, was growing up. He was learning. He was watching Charles of Navarre, studying his tricks. The wise king was beginning to understand how to defeat the bad king. Charles of Navarre thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could keep spinning the plates forever. He didn't realize that by betraying everyone, he had ensured that when he finally fell, there would be no one left to catch him. He had traded trust for fear, and fear is a currency that devalues very quickly when you are no longer the one holding the knife. His golden age was a mirage. He'd climbed to the very edge of the precipice, staring at the throne of France mere inches away. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. In his obsession with the crown, he had made himself the enemy of peace itself. And peace eventually would fight back. The omens were there. His allies were growing tired of his treachery. The English didn't trust him. The French hated him. The people of Paris, once his adoring fans, began to see him for what he was, a chaos agent who brought only suffering. The fall wouldn't be sudden. It would be a slow, agonizing dismantling of everything he had built, a stripping away of his lands, his reputation and his power, until he was left with nothing but his bitter, burning rage, and of course, a bottle of brandy and a candle. Gravity is inevitable. No matter how high you climb, no matter how many daggers you juggle or how many kings you outsmart, eventually the ground rushes up to meet you. For Charles of Navarre, the fall didn't happen in a single day. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. The walls of Europe began to close in, inch by inch, until there was nowhere left to run. The architect of his destruction was the very man he had underestimated, Charles V of France, known as the Wise. While Charles of Navarre had spent his life playing checkers, taking pieces, killing knights, causing chaos, Charles V was playing chess. He realized that you don't defeat a man like the King of Navarre on the battlefield. You defeat him by making him irrelevant. Slowly, methodically, the French king began to dismantle Charles's power base. He didn't storm castles, he bought them. He bribed Charles's mercenaries to switch sides. He used the law, the one weapon Charles thought he had mastered, to declare the King of Navarre's lands in Normandy forfeit. The noose was tightening. The turning point, the moment the bad king truly became a hunted animal, came in 1378. It was the year the master plotter was finally outplotted. A conspiracy was uncovered, a plot so dark it shocked even the hardened sensibilities of the medieval court. Charles of Navarre, desperate and losing his grip, had allegedly sent his chamberlain, a man named Jacques de Roux, to Paris with a terrifying mission: to poison the King of France. This wasn't a noble war for a birthright anymore. It was the desperate act of a cornered rat. The plan was to put arsenic in the royal food, but the plot failed. Jacques de Roux was captured. And in the dungeons of the Châtelet, under the question, the polite term for torture, he sang. He spilled everything. He painted his master not as a prince, but as a demon who dabbled in witchcraft and poison. The backlash was catastrophic. Charles of Navarre was stripped of every acre of land he held in France. The dream of the French crown, the obsession that had fueled his entire existence, was legally and physically obliterated. His agents were dragged to Les Halles in Paris and quartered, ripped apart by horses while the mob cheered. Charles, safe in his mountain kingdom of Navarre, could only watch from afar as his network of spies and allies was butchered. He was exiled, not officially, but effectively. He was forced to retreat to Pamplona, to the small mountainous kingdom he had always neglected. To him, Navarre wasn't a home, it was a prison. It was a cage of cold stone and jagged peaks, far from the luxury and power of Paris. And it was here, in the freezing isolation of the Pyrenees, that the final betrayal occurred. It wasn't a betrayal by a friend or a lover or a king. It was a betrayal by his own body. By the mid-1380s, Charles was a shadow of the vibrant, dangerous man he had been. He was in his 50s, but he looked 80. A mysterious illness began to consume him. The chroniclers of the time, often biased, called it leprosy, a divine punishment for his wicked life. Modern doctors suspect it might have been a severe circulatory disorder or a paralytic disease. Whatever the cause, the effect was a living nightmare. The man who had never stopped moving, who had ridden from Normandy to Pamplona, who had danced at balls and led armies, began to freeze. His limbs lost their sensation. His hands, which had signed so many death warrants, curled into useless claws. His legs, which had carried him to so many betrayals, refused to hold his weight. He became a prisoner in his own flesh. Imagine the psychological torture. A mind as sharp and restless as Charles's. Trapped inside a decaying, immobile corpse, he spent his days in bed, staring at the ceiling, barking orders that took longer and longer to be obeyed. The court of Navarre became a place of whispers. His courtiers looked at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They smelled the sickness on him, the scent of rotting skin and stale sweat. The paranoia set in. He was convinced, perhaps rightly, that everyone wanted him dead. He saw assassins in the shadows. He tasted poison in every cup of wine. He ordered his guards to double their watch, terrified that the French or the Castilians would come to finish him off while he lay helpless. But no one came. They didn't need to. Fate was doing the job for them. The winter of 1386 turned into 1387, and the cold of the mountains seemed to seep into his very bones. He was always cold. No amount of furs, no amount of fire in the hearth could warm him. His circulation was failing. His extremities were turning blue. The pain was excruciating, a deep gnawing ache that never slept. He was desperate for a cure. He summoned doctors from all over Europe, Jewish physicians from Zaragoza, Moorish healers from the south, Christian doctors from the universities. He promised them gold, titles, anything, if they could just make him feel warm again, if they could just give him back the use of his limbs. And this desperation is what led to the final, fatal prescription. A new doctor arrived, a man whose name history has largely forgotten, but whose idea would become legendary. He looked at the shivering, grey-skinned king and proposed a radical treatment. It wasn't a potion to drink or a salve to rub. It was a full-body immersion. "We must wrap the king in the essence of warmth," the doctor likely said. "We must sew him into sheets soaked in the strongest spirits, so the heat of the alcohol penetrates the skin and revives the blood." It sounded plausible. It sounded like science. In the desperate mind of Charles of Navarre, it sounded like hope. He agreed. And so the servants were called. The finest linen sheets were brought out. The expensive brandy, the aqua vitae, was uncorked. The room filled with the sharp, stinging fumes of alcohol. It smelled like a tavern, but it felt like a surgery. They lifted the king's paralyzed body, a humiliating ordeal in itself, and laid him onto the soaked fabric. They wrapped him tight, like a mummy, binding him so he couldn't move, even if he wanted to. Then, to ensure the vapors stayed in, they began to sew the sheets together, needle and thread, stitching the king into his alcohol-soaked cocoon. Charles lay there, staring up at the canopy of his bed. He was immobile, helpless, soaked in flammable liquid. The fumes were dizzying. The sun had set. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering torches on the walls and the candle held by the servant who was stitching the final thread. The stage was set for the end. The pieces were all in place. The paralyzed king, the flammable shroud, the careless hand, the open flame. The universe has a dark sense of irony. Charles had spent his life burning people, burning alliances, burning towns, burning bridges. He had ignited wars that consumed thousands. Now, in the quiet of his own bedroom, the fire was coming for him. And this time there were no negotiations, there were no treaties, there was only the spark. The servant leaned in to cut the thread. He didn't have scissors, so he did what servants often did in those days. He brought the candle flame close to the thread to burn it through. It was such a small mistake, a tiny, insignificant error. And then the world turned orange. It happened in the blink of an eye. One moment, there was the smell of brandy and the dim quiet of a sick room. The next, there was a sound, a soft, violent whoosh, like air being sucked into a vacuum. The alcohol fumes, invisible and heavy in the air, didn't just catch fire, they exploded. The flame jumped from the candle to the thread, and from the thread to the sheet. In a fraction of a second, the King of Navarre was no longer a man wrapped in linen, he was a torch. The blue ghost light of burning alcohol raced across his body, finding every fold, every soaked inch of fabric. Panic is a primal instinct. When we burn, we thrash, we roll, we tear at our clothes. But Charles couldn't move. That is the true horror of this moment. His paralyzed limbs, the very reason for this cursed treatment, refused to obey him. He was a prisoner inside a burning cage, sewn tight by his own servants. He couldn't roll on the floor to smother the flames. He couldn't rip the sheets away. He could only open his mouth and scream he did. The chroniclers say the sound was inhuman, a high-pitched, gargling wail that shattered the silence of the palace. The heat was instantaneous and absolute. The brandy burned hot and fast, fusing the linen to his skin, cooking the flesh beneath. And the servant? The man holding the candle? He didn't grab a bucket of water. He didn't throw himself on the king to put out the fire. Overcome by terror, watching the monarch turn into a pillar of flame, he dropped the candle and ran. He fled the room, slamming the door on the screaming inferno behind him. For moments that must have felt like centuries. Charles of Navarre burned alone. By the time help arrived, alerted by the smell of smoke and the blood-curdling screams, the damage was catastrophic. They burst into the room to find a blackened, writhing form on the bed. They managed to extinguish the flames, likely with heavy blankets or water, but the act of putting out the fire was torture in itself. The burnt fabric peeled away, taking the king's skin with it. But here is the twist. Here is the part of the story that makes it worse than a simple execution. Charles did not die that night. The Grim Reaper, who Charles had flirted with for so long, decided to be cruel. The fire failed to kill him instantly. Instead, it left him a ruin of a man, stripped of his skin, his body a map of third-degree burns, yet fully conscious. He lingered for 2 weeks, 14 days of agony that defies description. He lay in his bed, the same bed that had betrayed him, unable to sleep, unable to find comfort. The pain was absolute. Every breath was a labor. His body, already weakened by his mysterious paralysis, now had to fight off the massive infection setting in from the burns. Imagine the atmosphere in Pamplona during those 2 weeks. The king is dying, slowly, loudly. The palace smells of burnt flesh and rot. The courtiers whisper in the hallways, terrified, and the priests begin to talk. News of the accident spread across Europe faster than the fire itself, and to the enemies of Charles, to the Valois in Paris, to the Pope in Avignon. This was not a tragedy. It was a sermon. It was proof. The Bishop of Nantes took to the pulpit and declared, "By God's justice, he burned in this life as he shall burn in the next." They said it was divine retribution. They said the fire was a physical manifestation of the hellfire waiting for him. They pointed to his treachery, his poisons, his plots, and said, Look at how the devil claims his own." The story of the brandy and the candle became a morality play, told in taverns and churches from London to Rome. The bad king wasn't just dying. He was being unmade by his own sins. Finally, on January 16, 1387, the screaming stopped. Charles II of Navarre, the man who would have been King of France, breathed his last. He died not in glory, but in a whimper of exhausted pain. He was 54 years old. When they buried him, they didn't bury a hero. They buried a cautionary tale. His heart was removed, a custom of the time, and sent to the cathedral in Pamplona. His entrails were buried at Roncesvalles. His body was interred in the Cathedral of Santa Maria. Even in death, he was scattered, just as he had scattered his loyalties in life. So, what are we to make of Charles the Bad? It is easy to look at the caricature history has drawn for us. The villain, the schemer, the man who poisoned rival knights and switched sides like a snake. It is easy to say he got what he deserved, that the fire was karma. But look closer. Look at the boy who was told he was royalty, then stripped of his crown by a room full of lawyers. Look at the prince who saw his mother humiliated and his birthright stolen. Charles was a man born into a world that broke its promises to him before he could even speak. His entire life was a reaction to that initial wound. He became the bad because being the good got his father nothing and his mother less. He was a modern man born in the wrong century. In the Renaissance, 100 years later, a man like Charles, Machiavellian, astute, willing to break moral codes for political gain, might have been celebrated as a genius. He was a precursor to the realpolitik of the future. But in the 14th century, a time of chivalry and religious dogmatism, he was a monster. His tragedy was that he possessed the ambition of a Caesar, but the luck of a cursed man. He spent 50 years trying to climb a mountain that was greased with oil. And when he finally stopped climbing, when he finally lay down to rest, the mountain burned him alive. The mystery of his death remains not in the how, but in the why. Was it truly an accident? Some historians have suggested that the servant wasn't careless, but paid, that the Valois finally found a way to kill the man they couldn't defeat in battle. A bribed doctor, a clumsy servant, a flammable sheet. It would be the perfect, deniable assassination. A murder disguised as a medical tragedy. We will never know. The smoke of that night obscures the truth forever, but the legacy of Charles of Navarre is clear. He teaches us something terrifying about the nature of power. We like to believe that history is shaped by great battles and grand speeches, but sometimes history is shaped by the small, fragile things: a legal document that disinherits a child, a vial of poison, a loose thread, a flickering candle. Charles wanted to be remembered as the King of France. He wanted statues, tapestries, and songs sung in his honor. Instead, he is remembered as the man who burned. He is remembered as the villain in someone else's story. He spent his life lighting fires to burn down the world around him. In the end, he simply forgot that fire has no master. It consumes the king just as easily as it consumes the peasant. And that is the final, brutal lesson of Charles the Bad. You can play with fire your entire life. You can use it to forge crowns and destroy enemies. But eventually, if you play long enough, you will be the one who burns. Thank you for watching this journey into the dark heart of medieval history. Stories like Charles's are often hidden in the footnotes, overshadowed by the more heroic tales of knights and crusades. But it is in these shadows that we find the real human drama, the pain, the ambition, and the grotesque ends that await us all. If you enjoyed this deep dive, if you felt the heat of the room and the chill of the betrayal, please consider subscribing to the channel. It takes a lot of research to bring these forgotten stories back to life, and your support means the world. And now, I have a question for you. Was Charles truly the bad, or was he a victim of a system that stole his future, a man fighting for what was rightfully his? Was his death an accident, or do you believe it was the final, perfect assassination? Let me know in the comments below. And don't click away just yet. The video appearing on your screen now tells the story of another monarch who met a gruesome, mysterious end. A queen who was said to have bathed in blood to keep her youth. If you thought Charles' story was dark, you haven't seen anything yet. Click now and let's descend further into the madness of history.